to share a little bit about. I'm glad to hear you guys have a understanding and familiarity with IJM's work. So I'm actually going to start by talking about IJM's work, and we're going to talk about the problem that IJM is addressing, which is everyday violence, especially in developing countries. We're going to look at IJM's solution to that problem. So I think we can summarize as justice system strengthening. And then we're going to zoom out from IJM, and we're actually going to just talk about, I want to spend some time talking about how to think and to solve complex social problems. And I especially want to focus in on something that I'm not sure if y'all have engaged with in your course, but something I'm really passionate about, which is a approach and a methodology called systems thinking. And systems thinking is really just a way to accomplish having a deep understanding of something, so that you can engage in the most constructive ways possible. And then finally, we're going to look at a case study of advocacy and how IJM has done research to have a deep understanding of a problem and then responded to a global problem. In this case, it's called OSEC, which is the online sexual exploitation of children. And we'll end by talking about certain pieces of legislation that IJM is currently advocating for to respond to this global problem. Okay, so apologies if y'all are already familiar with IJM's work. I can go through this overview pretty quickly, but when we think about IJM's work and we think about the problem that IJM really is seeking to solve is best framed as violence against people who are experiencing poverty. So it's important to understand that violence is as much a part of poverty as things like hunger, disease, or homelessness. This isn't, the violence of war and genocide, but the work that IJM focuses on is common criminal violence that's already against the law, that happens every day, that rarely makes headlines. And it's crimes like slavery, violence against women and children, and police abuse of power. So this is where IJM feels called to work. The reality is that criminals in a lot of contexts around the world are able to thrive, to commit crimes with impunity because of weak justice systems and because they've learned to expect no consequences for their crimes. So that's the problem that IJM is working to solve. And to think about the scope of this issue, there are over 50 million people currently living in slavery around the world. This is actually more people than have been living in slavery at any other point in human history. And this is a $150 billion industry, human trafficking around the world. And more broadly, 5 billion people live outside of the protection of the law. Okay, so what does that phrase mean, to live outside the protection of the law? Well, imagine that someone is trying to break into your home and you go to call 911, except there is no 911. There's no 911 to call. Person breaks into your home, maybe they steal something, and then you're thinking, gosh, I want to prosecute, to have some sort of legal recourse here, but the court systems are so broken that there's no shot of this person, even though you know who they are and can prove that what they did was that they committed this crime, that you just know there's no shot of you being able to prosecute this person. So this is the idea in a lot of developing countries around the world of what it means to live outside of the protection of the law, where criminals are able to commit crimes with impunity. Okay, so what is IJM's solution to this problem of everyday violence? Well, they have 4 main programs. The first is to strengthen criminal justice systems. So this looks like partnering with police and judges to train them to be more effective in their jobs. And then the second thing they do is to rescue and restore victims, to actually do casework to support those victims. So they work with local authorities to rescue those victims, but then they want to actually bring those cases into courts and to go through the criminal process, the legal process in that country, to eventually bring those criminals to justice. And as they are doing these cases, they are able to have a deep understanding of the criminal justice systems where they operate, to find gaps, and then to work to fill those gaps and to strengthen the justice system as a whole. And eventually what this leads to is scaling demand for protection by equipping champions everywhere to advocate for a safer and more just world for everyone. So that's what IJM does. Their vision is to rescue millions, protect 500 million, and to make justice unstoppable. And later we'll zoom in on this issue of OSEC, which is a primary area of focus for IJM these days. But before we do that, I want to actually take a step back. So as I said, I was kind of nerding out as I learned what this class is up to, about doing research to have a deeper understanding of various justice issues around the world. And I wanted to offer some ideas and concepts and tools to be able to think about how do we actually solve these complex social problems. And specifically, I'm going to focus on a field of study and practice called systems thinking. So systems thinking is a broad field. We're barely going to scratch the surface in our brief time together. But one of the common questions that systems thinking seeks to answer is, how do we get to the root cause of the problem? And the great challenge with this question is that social issues often have a high level of complexity. Human beings are kind of unpredictable creatures. And a lot of times we're wrong. Sometimes we're wrong about what the root cause of the problem actually is. And so we have to do the hard work of acquiring a deep understanding as we are pursuing action in the world to advance justice. Two Cornell professors whose work I appreciate, Derek and Laura Cabrera, they address this idea in their book, Systems Thinking Made Simple. They write, wicked problems result from the mismatch between how real-world systems work and how we think they work. Systems thinking attempts to resolve this mismatch. So fairly simple definition here. And again, the reason that this kind of deep thinking is so important is because when we are wrong about how an unjust system actually works, we might actually cause harm when we are trying to help. Or even if we don't cause harm, we may just miss opportunities to do as much good as we possibly can. We might just be treating symptoms and miss the root cause of the issue. As I said, systems thinking is a broad discipline. But I want to give a few simple techniques that come from systems thinking literature to help us grapple with this idea of how to do research to fight injustice. And so here are 5 kind of quick ideas. The first is to assume that social systems are complex. So when working to address an injustice, it's important to avoid being naive or simplistic, but instead, again, to do the hard work of achieving a deep understanding of what exactly is happening. Second, it's really helpful to make your thoughts visual with a map of ideas or stakeholders. So making a visual is a really common tool for systems thinkers. It's a powerful way to clarify thinking and to begin to grapple again with some of the complexity and the interrelationships between actors and stakeholders within a particular system. Third, systems thinkers like to point out that we all have cognitive biases. And so because of our own biases, we need to work to become aware of those biases, but then also we need to work to counteract them as we do our research. And one of the best ways to do that is to proactively explore different perspectives and invite alternative viewpoints. So doing this sharpens our thinking and it helps us to gain clarity. And then finally, as we do research, we should look for positive and negative feedback loops. So what do I mean by that? So I mean, this is when you do something and then there's a set of other consequences that might be totally unanticipated, unexpected, that maybe cause harm in an unexpected way or that do good in an unexpected way. So by looking for these feedback loops, it helps it to answer questions like, could this intervention lead to a negative unintended consequence? Or perhaps on the other side, perhaps there's an intervention that's catalytic and that could solve multiple problems at the same time. So as you're doing systems thinking, mapping out these systems, this is a really important thing to think about. Okay, so as I mentioned, I've done a couple kind of consulting projects for foundations and philanthropists. This is some work that I did with my team to respond to CSEC, which is an acronym that stands for the Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children. So really just a heavy topic, horrible injustice in the US and around the world, more commonly called child sex trafficking. And so what we wanted to do is to map out what are the leading interventions to respond to CSEC in the US. And so we actually came up with these 15 interventions within the categories of prevention, rescue, and rehabilitation. But what happened was, as we started thinking about the different stakeholders and the different people involved in this system, we realized that these are all 3 of these are really connected. When prevention fails, that results in victims of CSEC. But when victims are rescued, then we have survivors who need to be cared for. And so and it's actually really, really important to care for survivors, because if survivors don't receive access to the proper care, they're oftentimes re-victimized. And rates of re-victimization are as high as 80% for survivors who don't receive trauma-informed care that they need. And so you start to see these connections, and you start to just grapple with the complexity of the system, opportunities to engage, and by really doing the research and getting a deep understanding, we were able to kind of map out what would be the most effective path forward. So here's another example of system thinking kind of in practice, looking at IJM as a case study here. And this is just to consider, again, that root cause analysis kind of idea. So IJM is looking to respond to slavery, the police abuse of power, and violence against women and children. And as they are wrestling with, okay, how do we solve these problems? How do we reduce these various kinds of violence? They identified that underneath all of these injustices is this cause of broken criminal justice systems. It's criminal justice systems that sometimes cause harm, where the police are actually abusing their power, or the criminal justice systems are so weak, that vulnerable women and children are not able to receive any protection from them. So this is just another way of kind of taking some systems thinking ideas to think critically, to visualize how to respond to an injustice. So anyways, I hope something there was helpful. I know that was like just a flyover that's really fast, but I just want to say, I think this is why the kind of research that y'all are doing is really important. That I think the research is a key facet of being able to do justice well. And so, just apply to all of you for working on those projects. Okay, so for the rest of our time together, I want to focus on a specific injustice that IJM is currently working to address called OSEC, which stands for the Online Sexual Exploitation of Children. So OSEC, plainly understood, is a broad category of crimes, and IJM's work in this space focuses on children who are used by traffickers to create photos, videos, and live streams depicting sexual abuse and exploitation of children, usually to satisfy the demand around the world for this material. So the global epicenter of production of this material is in the Philippines, where child sexual abuse is live streamed. But there are remote sex offenders around the world who pay for this material's production. And children as young as 2 months old are trafficked by people who are often trusted individuals in their lives, like parents, relatives, friends, or even neighbors. So really just a horrifying injustice that's happening in the world that's actually getting worse with the advent of the internet. It got worse during the pandemic. It's a crime that is primarily fueled by demand from foreign sex offenders who are shielded by the virtual world of the internet. And the top consumers of this content are the US, the UK, Australia, and Canada, with the United States being the largest consumer, driving demand for the online sexual exploitation of children. So how exactly does this crime happen? So IJM's work, by doing research to understand this crime, they've identified this kind of these 4 stages. So first, offenders connect to each other via social networks. And then the demand side offender and trafficker, they'll communicate using common text communication platforms. So this could be things like WhatsApp or Facebook. And then the demand side offender will transfer payments to the trafficker through any common money transfer tool that you or I might use. And to give some context on the scale of these remittances, the Philippines Anti-Money Laundering Council reported in April 2023 that from mid-2020 through 2022, over 182,000 suspicious transaction reports related to the online sexual exploitation of children were conducted. So those reports totaled nearly 1.56 billion Philippine pesos, which is around 27 million US dollars. And 81% of those suspicious transaction reports are incoming foreign remittances, which means that 81% of those transaction reports were from foreign nations. So again, just emphasizing that this is a global crime where the buyer is often in a different country from the trafficker. And then after payment, the trafficker shares the child sexual exploitation materials, or CSEM, through video or by live streaming the exploitation. So when we're facing a crime as heinous as children being exploited online, we're often driven to action. We want to act now, to act today, to make moves, make a difference, make a change, to do something. And while action is important, we cannot miss the critical step of slowing down and assessing the problem, of doing research and understanding exactly what's happening. Certainly fighting for justice and taking action sound more enticing and motivational than research. But the reality is that we cannot win the fight for justice if we don't have a deep understanding of what we're up against. And this is where a study entitled Scale of Harm began. So the study focused on the prevalence of a specific subset of online sexual abuse and exploitation of children, which is the trafficking of children to produce new child sexual exploitation material. Again, that acronym is CSEM. And this study, the Scale of Harm study, was in the Philippines, and it was a partnership between IJM's Center to End Online Sexual Exploitation of Children and the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab. And the Scale of Harm study had two central objectives. The first was to estimate the number of children trafficked for CSEM production and the number of traffickers in the Philippines in 2022. And the second objective was to develop and test a survey that could be replicated to estimate national prevalence over time, so that IJM could be aware of whether or not their efforts to fight OSEC moving forward were actually working. If you don't know what the baseline is, you don't actually know if what you're doing is effective and is working. And before I go into the results of this study, the Scale of Harm study, I just want to take a moment to really appreciate the amount of work that went into it. It turned out to be a 78-page report that is now nationally recognized as the baseline study, which determines this immense global problem of OSEC. And without those 78 pages, we can't see the scale of this problem. It's invisible to us. Without those 78 pages, the hundreds of thousands of children in the Philippines alone who are being exploited are unseen. And the global nature of this crime, with many perpetrators originating right here in the United States, is also unseen and unappreciated. And so, most importantly, without those 78 pages, we don't really understand the opportunity we have to address the crime head on and bring restoration to the children who deserve to be living in freedom. And so just say that kind of work is really advancing justice in the long run. And it's a kind of justice that honestly requires wisdom, that requires recognizing the complexity of the world. So the main finding of the Scale of Harm study is that nearly 500,000 children in the Philippines were trafficked to produce new sexual exploitation material in 2022 alone. So that actually breaks down to 1 in every 100 Filipino children, which is just alarming and heartbreaking, and even more so when you consider that this is, you could say that the statistic represents real children in that number. And the second main finding of the study is that nearly 250,000 adult Filipinos trafficked children. So 250,000 adults were traffickers and perpetrators of this crime to produce CSEM in 2022. And that breaks down to 3 in every 1,000 adult Filipinos. And of course, as you might imagine, there's a significant disparity between these national estimates of the prevalence of the crime and the number of victims brought to safety and suspects actually arrested. Sorry, everyone. Been fighting a bit of a cough. Grab some water. Okay, so where do we go from here? What do we do after doing the research? What is IJM doing to respond to um, this emerging global crime? We're really at a critical inflection point. There was actually a congressional hearing that y'all might have seen, I think less than a month ago, with leading tech companies around this issue of protecting children online and keeping them safe online. And there's several bills pending in the U.S., which, if passed, could be game changers. So the idea behind those bills is that every industry and sector is governed by laws and rules that require their products and services to be safe, and it's especially safe for children. So if you think about car seats and cribs and all the rules put in place requiring those products to be as safe as possible for children. But the reality is that the tech sector has never been required to build their apps, platforms, and products to be safe by design, to keep kids safe online and to prevent child sexual exploitation material from proliferating online. And so, just like any other product, we need more laws and rules to address this safety concern for tech platforms. And so, there are currently 5 pieces of legislation that are kind of in Congress being reviewed, being considered, and the one that IJM is really getting behind is called the Earn It Act. So the Earn It Act incentivizes tech companies to do everything in their power to prevent child exploitation material from ending up on their platforms. It'll strengthen reporting requirements for the cyber tip line so that children can be brought to safety sooner and perpetrators can be identified and arrested. And in light of the research of that IJM did in the scale of harm study, they really think that this act, the Earn It Act, is the most strategic one possible to be able to fight this global crime and to begin to move the needle to protect children around the world. And again, because IJM began this work by doing in-depth research, they can come to the table in advocacy with crucial information around the prevalence of the crime, around how it actually works, how the US is implicated by being the source of a lot of the demand for this material. And they're able to use that research, that credible research and information in order to influence a piece of legislation like the Earn It Act. And so when we think about advocacy, the reality is that our words matter and our ideas matter. And the strength and credibility of those ideas really matters. And matters for the millions of women and men and children who are experiencing violent oppression right now. And matters for the 500,000 Filipino children who were sexually exploited online just in 2022. And I believe, in this work of justice, I believe we all have a part that we can play in building a world where everyone is able to be safe and protected. And yes, I think that we can and we should take action. But a lot of times it's most helpful to first slow down, assess the problem, and do deep research, because in the long run, I believe this is how we will actually win the fight for justice. So